Well, President Trump criticized Iran in his speech today at the United Nations. American officials are blaming Tehran for attacks on Saudi oil fields facilities. The president insisted that the U.S. wants peace and does not believe in permanent enemies. But Mr. Trump also reminded world leaders of the strong economic sanctions that the U.S. has imposed on Iran. He called on them to follow America's lead.
All nations have a duty to act. No responsible government should subsidize Iran's bloodlust. As long as Iran's menacing behavior continues, sanctions will not be lifted. They will be tightened. Iran's leaders will have turned a proud nation into just another cautionary tale of what happens when a ruling class abandons its people and embarks on a crusade for personal power and riches.
And Paula, Reid is here. I want to also bring in Behnam Taleblu. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. So, Paula, I want to turn to you first. Did we learn anything new on Iran from the president's UN speech today?
It was interesting to see how he approached this issue. It was a big pivot from the rest of the UN, where he had mostly been pushing American political drama, not necessarily America first. Here, he dove into some substance. We expected that he would touch on Iran, but what was interesting is he did not lay out a case against Iran in terms of the recent attack on Saudi Arabia. And he wrapped a lot of his comments about Iran in the larger theme from his administration, which is that he wants to avoid what he describes as endless wars through diplomacy. And he noted, for example, with North Korea, he said sometimes that's a little unusual to some people. They were wondering why I was reaching out to North Korea. But he said the U.S. should not have, quote, permanent enemies. He said there's plenty of people we have relationships with now who we were once at war with. And he said he wants to try diplomatic paths to continue to forge these better relationships to avoid wars. So that should be a message that is somewhat heartening to Tehran, but it doesn't appear that they really made any progress. And of course, at this point, we don't expect the president will meet with any of his Iranian counterparts during this trip.
You know, Behnam, we saw yesterday world leaders Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, Boris Johnson. They actually joined the U.S. in blaming Iran for the attacks on Saudi oil fields. Does that reinforce the president's stance on Iran? Are they backing what he has to say?
Well, absolutely, and that is a historic step. You know, the European nations have more, unfortunately, since May 8, 2019, which is when the U.S. left the JCPOA nuclear deal. Unfortunately, they had been tacking closer towards Tehran, the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, than Washington. This is a pretty significant first step. I think the administration would like to see these three European nations, known as the E3, to move the EU to do more on the Iran file, to do Iran sanctions, to work on Iran's regional missile and military issues. But this is a positive step, but just up to these three European capitals now to turn this rhetoric into reality and help bridge this transatlantic gap that I think Iran, until very recently, has been exploiting.
You know, there are some European countries that have been so supportive of Iran, Behnam. Are there any allies for Iran at the United Nations?
Well, Iran has long tried to marshal members of the non-aligned movement. It's long tried to play up the differences between President Trump and other presidents here in the States. It's also tried to play up, of course, the U.S. penchant or preference for unilateralism over multilateralism and reframing America as opposed to Iran as the international pariah. These things actually have not been sufficient to insulate the regime from tough sanctions. And also, this is the way that the regime has likely been looking to win diplomatically against the U.S. while it's been losing economically. And even, you could say, in the region, Iran is having to lash out because it feels like it's in a corner.
Paula, do folks at the Treasury Department at the White House believe that these sanctions on Iran are working?
They do. The president has repeatedly said, his Treasury Secretary has said, that the maximum pressure campaign they believe is working. But that's not what our allies believe. And their conduct recently suggests that this has not exactly had a deterrent effect. But it does appear that they've pretty much issued all the sanctions that they could that would actually have an impact. But if you ask them, yes, they would say maximum pressure has worked.
So, Behnam, should the bottom line be the president should keep up the pressure, the highest level of sanctions on Iran at this point? How do they move forward?
Absolutely, and just with immense respect to Paula, I don't think we're anywhere near maxing out our sanctions with respect to Iran. There are still sectors of the Iranian economy that are owned or controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This is really that nasty, hardened group of military men whose veterans are across Iran's politics and society currently. They are the one really in charge of this foreign and security policy. So there is still much more left to sanction, you could say. There's the construction sector, the rest of the petrochemical sector. There's entities that help Iran bring in revenue illicitly, of course. There's exposing Iran's hand when it comes to proliferation networks, procurement networks, and of course there's going after Iran's myriad proxies in the region, as well as its partners and the installations that it's building across the Middle East and the Gulf.
So before we go, I want to ask Paula and get you to weigh in about, the president accused China of failing to adopt reforms ahead of talks, trade talks, coming up soon in a few weeks. Here's some of what he had to say.
The American people are absolutely committed to restoring balance to our relationship with China. Hopefully, we can reach an agreement that will be beneficial for both countries. But as I have made very clear, I will not accept a bad deal for the American people.
So, Paul, where do these trade talks stand right now?
Well, the president had delayed the most recent round of tariffs as a gesture of goodwill. We know that talks continue over the next several weeks, but there's no expectation that they're actually going to reach a deal. The best case scenario is that there are signs that there's maybe some progress over the next few weeks. We know additional tariffs will also go into effect in December. But in speaking with senior administration officials, Reid, it's clear they are willing to play a long game here. The president was asked last week if he felt he needed a trade deal before the 2020 election. He said no. He wants to get the right deal, and it does appear that there is a commitment within the Trump administration, and they believe that voters are with them on this. Even if this is hitting farmers and consumers, they believe that people understand that there needs to be a new trade deal with China, and if they're going to be a global economic player, they need to play by new rules. But there are concerns by business leaders, economists, bipartisan economic assessments that this trade war is having such an effect on the economy that there could potentially be a recession late next year. So it's unclear how this will impact the president in the polls, but they are confident that voters are with them and that they need to continue to pursue this until they get the deal they want.
All right, Paula, Reid and Behnam Taleblu, I want to thank you both for joining us.